Hello. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Joshua Dyer. I am the Director of Marketing at Museum of Toronto. For those of you who are new to Museum, we are a museum in Toronto focused on sharing some of the lesser known and untold stories of the city. We're also a museum without walls, so our programs, events, and exhibits take place at different venues across the city and online, as is the case today. This discussion today, as you might imagine, was definitely inspired by the recent and ongoing protests and demonstrations against systemic and anti-Black racism that have swept the globe. As a museum focused on the stories and histories of Toronto, we wanted to do our part in ensuring this narrative of systemic racism isn't again deflected as an American issue as it often has been. But rather we wanted to recenter that dialogue in a Canadian context and create an opportunity to discuss how the targeted surveillance and policing of Black and Indigenous communities is active and alive right here in our city, how it's impacting our communities, and what we all can do about it. With that said, we are really honored to have this panel join us today. These women have all played a crucial role in advocating for Black and Indigenous voices in Canada and advocating against the historic erasure of systemic racism in this country. So I'd like to welcome you all. I'd like to thank you for joining us. And really, I'd like to thank you all for the work that you do. With that said, I'd like to introduce our narrator for today, Rania El-Mugamar. Rania, thanks again for joining Museum.
Thank you so much, Joshua, and to the Museum team for putting this together. So I'm going to do a land acknowledgement and introduce myself and set a bit of the context here before I invite our panelists to join us in introducing themselves and in exploring some of the questions for today's conversation. So my name is Rania El-Mugamar. I'm an artist, a social justice educator, and a consultant. I primarily work in arts and culture, digital justice, abolition, and reproductive justice. I'm going to be your moderator, and I'll be offering the land acknowledgement and some of the framing. So I want to acknowledge that while we're gathered digitally today, many of us are calling in from stolen Indigenous lands. I am calling in from the relative safety of my home in the Wampum Treaty Belt by way of Shambat in the Valley of the Nile, residing here in Toronto, the gathering place where the trees stand tall on the water, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Métis, the Pétun, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And we're here because this land is occupied. The architecture of the language of the word occupied invites us to name the ongoing and relentless and resilient resistance of Indigenous people to settler colonialism from its onset to the present moment. I want to invite us to reflect on the personal work of decolonization and how to approach our land acknowledgements with a sense of individual and collective responsibility and not to relegate them to housekeeping or performance, to see our fractal parts in this living and emergent whole. This land has been home to Indigenous communities since time immemorial and continues to be to this day, shared with settlers, colonizers, displaced peoples, stolen peoples, arrivants, unwelcome guests, and all life, the winged, the four-legged, those who slither, and the ones who swim in the sea, a land whose history extends vastly beyond the colonial imagination. I want to situate us here, the knowledge that we generate, share, and explore as part of an ongoing and vast body of work, which names, interrogates, and challenges policing, incarceration, and state-sanctioned violence created by generations of Black and Indigenous artists, organizers, educators, elders, leaders, healers, teachers, revolutionaries, warriors, resistors, everyday people who objected to the violence of their realities. What we do here is possible because of this work, and it contributes to its living, breathing archive. We are not without ancestors, who at this moment I call in and honor, those we know and celebrate, those whose names we have forgotten, deliberately obscured, or never really came to know. Equally important are our contemporaries, our siblings in the struggle, adapting to every iteration of injustice, making the invisible visible. Some of us will know these realities. We will see ourselves reflected in the numbers, the stories, and the systems. I'm holding space for all of you. Please engage in the ways that make sense for you and let me know if I can be of any support to you afterwards. For some of you, it's a new conversation, an expansive one. To you, I say welcome. Sit in the discomfort a while, listen always. Our conversation today will allow us to begin to unravel the historical context of policing that is fundamentally rooted in dehumanization and exploitation of Black and Indigenous lives and their various intersections, and maintaining a monopoly over legitimized violence in service of those who are in power. Our conversation invites us to explore the ways in which it overlaps with other systems of violence and to dream up possibilities for our collective futures. I want to offer something to sort of help us pivot towards this conversation with openness and a good mind and deep listening. I want to remind us that every system, institution, and violence was imagined deliberately by somebody. We are literally living in someone's fever dream, and these are not our only options. These conversations allow us to resist the capturing of our imaginations, that with solidarity, we can dream up something radically different. I want to invite at this point our wonderful panelists to introduce themselves before we tackle the questions. A reminder that you can also submit your questions using the Q&A function, and we'll incorporate some of those in the conversation as well as in the Q&A at the end. So at this point, I would love it if I can invite Caitlin to introduce yourself.
There we go. All right. So my name is Caitlin Casper. I'm a lawyer with Aboriginal Legal Services in Toronto. I am an Anishinaabe woman coming from Chippewas or Georgina Islands near the shores of Lake Simcoe in Ontario. I have an educational background. I went to University of Toronto and studied political science before doing my law degree at Osgoode Hall. When I completed my law degree at Osgoode Hall, I packed up my bags and I moved out of the city and worked out of Kenora, Ontario. And it was important for me to work in Kenora at the time because as there is now, there is an overwhelming population of First Nations who struggle in the areas of criminal law and a lot of justice related issues. So I worked in Kenora for just over between 4 to 5 years and did primarily criminal defense, child welfare, and family law. And it was an incredible experience before I closed my practice there and decided it was time to come home to be closer to my family in Southern Ontario. I've been working with Aboriginal Legal Services, like I said, for just about 5 years. At ALS, I have the opportunity to do a lot of justice reform work and a lot of work that has to do with the ways in which Indigenous people, which include First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, are involved in the legal system. That can cover the ground of anywhere from civil-related type disputes through to a lot of intervention in criminal matters. A lot of work in the appellate courts, and then also representation for a lot of inquest work, which brings us often to those issues of police violence. Much of our work that does inquest and representation of families is as a result of police violence and interactions between Indigenous people and police services. So there is definitely a lot of information that I hope I'm able to share with everyone today, and a lot of background and knowledge that I hope I'm able to share as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Welcome. I would love to invite Sandy to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and being with us today. My name is Sandy. I'm an organizer with Black Lives Matter. And I also do a whole bunch of other things. But first, I'd like to say that I am joining you here from Tongva territory out on the west coast of the United States, what a lot of people will know as LA, but is also unceded territory of the Tongva people. And I'm here because I'm in law school at UCLA, where I study in the public interest legal program and the critical race studies specialization, which is the only one of its kind in North America, which is why I decided to come out here to do law. In addition to wearing those two hats, I also host a podcast with Nora Loretto called Sandy and Nora Talk Politics. And I'm the vice chair of the Black Legal Action Center. I also do a lot of writing. So you can see my writing in a whole bunch of different media spaces. And I also co-edited Until We Are Free, Reflections on Black Lives Matter in Canada.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sandy. Welcome. Robin, can I invite you to introduce yourself?
Hi there. My name is Robin Maynard. I'm probably best known for a book that I wrote a few years ago called Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present. I'm an occasional journalist. I always say I'm not a journalist and end up writing something. So I do a little bit of a freelance journalism when I feel called to it by a particular injustice, I suppose. It's not my primary occupation. I do a lot of writing in academic journals and trade journals and more broadly as well. And I am a Vanier Scholar right now at the University of Toronto. I have a long history in doing community-based outreach in Montreal, where I've spent most of my adult life until recently when I transplanted to Toronto, working with people in street-based economies, doing a lot of outreach with prison, in particular with Black and Indigenous women. So a lot of that history of doing harm reduction and community-based work has really informed the kind of writing that I do, the kind of social justice-oriented writing that I do. I've also been involved in movements, the No Borders movement, and Black liberation movements and abolitionist movements for over a decade.
Thank you so much, Robin, Sandy, and Caitlin for those introductions. I'd love to jump right in with some of the context and recognizing sort of the historical and ongoing ramifications of policing as it intersects with other forms of state violence. So I'd love to actually direct this question first to Robin. We're really thinking about what are the ways in which policing in Canada is connected to that historical and ongoing legacy of racial and colonial violence against Black and Indigenous communities, particularly because, I know I had the privilege of reading and rereading your book several times and really diving into the absenting of so much of that historical context from our public discourse that helps people feel a bit disconnected from police violence and the ongoing legacy of enslavement and colonialism.
Sure, thank you for that question. I really appreciate also your use of the word absenting, because really this kind of erasure, we really need to understand as something that's actively done again and again, erasing the legacy of slavery, erasing the ongoing violence that Black and Indigenous peoples experience in the form of policing from the public discourse, even though we've been, as Black community activists, as scholars, bringing this to the forefront for generations. So I think that it's really important for us to look at the historical development of what policing, particularly racialized policing, is in this country. We need to remember that slavery, of course, was something that was practiced, that was legal for 200 years. And even before the establishment of formal police, Black people were being surveilled in public space, were criminalized for being in public space, often only just for suspicion of having supposedly stolen themselves into freedom, of being supposedly runaway slaves, right? So we have the history of the surveillance of Black peoples. We have the very public placement of, for example, fugitive slave ads, what are called fugitive slave ads, that made Black people in public space be suspect for being criminals already. And the crime, of course, having just been asserting that you're free, insisting that you're free. And this is something that was violently punished. So this is an important precursor to the development of the policing of Black people with formal policing and law enforcement in this country. If we look to the development of the RCMP, which before that was actually called the Northwest Mounted Police, this is something that was actually explicitly developed towards partially the means of actually quelling Indigenous rebellion. That the RCMP itself was used also to police and to repress labor movement. So we need to understand the history of policing has actually always been a kind of economic control, as always a kind of racialized control that was particularly directed at Black peoples and at Indigenous peoples. That policing has always been about policing race and including other communities that at that point were not seen to be white, right? So Italians and Irish and Black women, for example, were all hyper-policed in public space in the 20th century because they were assumed to be involved in sex work, which really just meant that in public, they were surveilled, they were stopped, they were arrested, they were disproportionately charged. This is something that, again, was just part of, in early Canadian cities, was part of how policing functioned. Now, this is something that has really only developed and it's been exacerbated more and more over the generations as we've seen the budget in policing go up, the legislative powers that policing have over our lives go up. We've seen, that kind of surveillance and brutalization actually increase massively. So the rates of police killings, even over the last 20 years, have gone up substantially, as have police budgets. And now we know, for example, as you cited in the introduction, in the graphic, that Black people in Toronto are 20 times more likely to be shot and killed by police than white peoples. We know that in every city where it's been measured, whether that's Halifax, Lethbridge, Edmonton, Kingston, that Black people are disproportionately stopped. And that also this kind of surveillance in public space is itself, and Indigenous peoples as well, that's something that's crucial for this analysis, that this historical outgrowth is something that has actually only become increasingly militarized and increasingly violent, right? Where now we also see an increase of the use of tactical squads. And we know that Black people are being killed by SWAT teams in the context of minor drug busts. For example, Bonnie Jean-Pierre was a Black man in his late 40s who was killed in the context of a drug bust in Montreal a few years ago that resulted in a few grams of marijuana and a few other things. Whereas we know that, white citizens living, in the park downtown, for example, are able to smoke marijuana freely. So we just continue to see that policing is actually a kind of racial violence, has always been, and particularly in the present day. So I think that that's really the way that we need to understand it. That policing for our communities has never been about safety, has never been about security. In order for us to think about policing as public safety, then we have to totally discount the realities of Black peoples and of Indigenous peoples who are continually harmed by police. And also just remembering that, of course, while brutalization, violence at the hands of police is something that, of course, is a very real fear for Black parents as we raise our kids and teach them how to move through the world. But just as harmful is the possibility of arrest, of incarcerations that also remove people from their communities, from their families, that this is something that Black people are also targeted with disproportionately. So that policing is something that extends into, of course, the criminal justice system for Black and Indigenous communities as well. And that is itself a kind of violence that we don't always recognize when we only talk about violence as something that happens to the body.
Thank you so much for that, Robin. I really appreciate how you are pulling these threads between policing, incarceration, family separation, intergenerational trauma, destruction of community, in order to be able to understand the sort of ripple effect or the profound impact that is both wide and generations deep, policing for Black and Indigenous lives. Sandy, I'd love to talk to you about the contemporary moment as well as the historical one. And I'd love to sort of dive into a little bit of what Robin said around this idea of to protect and serve, right? And I think in some cultural contexts, in my cultural context, to house, to feed, to nurture is to protect and serve. So how can we begin to start thinking about that so that when we get there, we know how to do it. So I'd love to hear about both the historical context and the contemporary moment from you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, Robin just gave us such a rich kind of historical underpinning and understanding of how policing kind of developed. And we see that anti-Blackness, that colonialism continuing today in the way that policing is really not even about safety. When Robin says, that if we think about policing as safety, it discounts our experiences. Truly, I don't know that the police are keeping really anybody safe. maybe the wealthiest white men in our society. But generally, if we take a look truly at what policing is doing, a lot of it is constraining and restraining the movements of Black and Indigenous people in our society. It really is an institution that relegates us to very particular parts of an urban space or very particular parts of a place in which we live. It's a constraint mechanism, and it functions to make sure that the wealthy stay wealthy. The institution of policing as it was imagined, as it was created in Europe, was about property. It was about property for wealthy men and making sure that the property of wealthy men was safeguarded. And if we think about the way that white supremacy organized its relationship to Black people and Indigenous people, it's through property. It's through a genocide, removing people from how white people constructed their property as land, and through controlling property that is humans, Black people. And so that continues to this day as policing manifests as this institution that controls where Black people can go, how Black people can move, how we are watched in a city. You know, all of the solutions that people come up with that are rooted in reform of like, you know, like, well, maybe we'll do community policing, if, you know, more policing from the community, more police being around and becoming friends with people in the community so that things can get better. It's like, have you ever seen that? In, you know, I went to the University of Toronto. I don't see people thinking, hey, we need these cops to be friends with the students. Or, hey, we need these cops to be friends with the people out in Post Road where Drake's ostentatious house is. You know what I mean? It's only in certain places. And that is because the institution of policing is functioning as it was imagined at the very beginning, to constrain, control, and watch Black people, constrain, control, and watch Indigenous people. And you know, that colonial history, we should not just think about it as history. It is functioning contemporarily, right now, today, exactly like that.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Thank you for drawing our attention to the ways in which our imagination is even limited when we think of solutions. Like, why is the option, you know, murderous police or slightly nicer police, right? Like, why is no police not an option at all? Like, I would like that on the menu. So I really appreciate you sort of challenging us to think beyond these sort of reformist and ideals of policing. And I want to sort of touch on a lot of the things that both yourself and Robin shared as I redirect this question to Caitlin. Canada has this really very good PR, right? And good international branding around this Canada the Good, this peacekeeping role. And a big part of it is through thinking of Canada's history as this tiny little blip, right? When in reality, this is a land with 100,000 plus, you know, year history of human activity. And it's a land that as a nation has constructed itself through violence against Indigenous communities. So I'd love to hear where you feel there are overlapping experiences in terms of that historical and ongoing legacy of colonial and racialized violence in terms of Black and Indigenous communities, and where the Indigenous context requires us to expand our understanding.
So I think that Robin and Sandy set this up perfectly when they talk about this idea of policing as being fundamentally based on protection of property, and definitely about the genocide that's happened in North America on Turtle Island, that has largely been led by a colonial government that utilized the police as its enforcement system. So I think that when you take a look at that relationship that occurs and still exists today between police and Indigenous people, one of the things that we need to think about is where Canada came from in and of itself, and that whole idea of the fact that Canada in and of itself could not exist if it wasn't through settlement and economic development. All of that occurred, as we know, on all of the frontiers of Canada through the placement of Indigenous people from their traditional territories onto reserved land. One of those key elements of being moved onto that reserve system and to be part of, you know, that idea of manifest destiny was that there needed to be a form of control, a form of regulation, and the police, the Northwest Mounted Police first, then the RCMP, its sole purpose and function was to keep Indigenous people listening to the laws, most specifically through the Indian Act, which was first created in 1876 and still exists today. Was to utilize police as the enforcers of that piece of legislation. And so with these colonial aims of controlling Indigenous peoples so that settlement and so that economic development could occur within Canada, those consequences have echoed throughout the ages and throughout every generation. The RCMP and then through other police services that have occurred after the RCMP, the OPP, municipal police, everything else, one of their sole roles has always been to control Indigenous people. And so while in, I guess the worst parts of our history that involved residential school system, that involved the pass system, where police were utilized to enforce whether or not Indigenous people could leave their reserves, the taking of children and the policing of children and families to go and to stay present in the residential school system. There is such dysfunction that has occurred as a result of all of those control mechanisms and those control tactics. That's really what has led to such a deep, awful divide between the Indigenous capacity to trust police and to see that they actually have our best interests in mind, which we know through not only those historical actions, but also through what we see now in the present day, is not the case. So this is none of what I think any of us are saying is new or groundbreaking. We know that there have been multiple reports and commissions that have talked about the harms that have been done and about that fractured relationship between Indigenous people and the policing systems. And we've seen that the results of those are huge over-policing in some respects, and then also under-policing in a lot of respects when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous women. And all of that is very informative to all of the issues that we have to address today, because until, I think you're absolutely right when you say that it is impossible for us to truly understand where we're going to go and how we're going to work our way out of this problem if we don't understand the context from which it all comes from. And that is through that whole idea of we are living in a colonial system with a colonial government, and the police were the enforcers of that system and still are today.
Thank you so much for that, Caitlin. I think when we dive into this second question here, I'd love to circle back around to you and to talk about the precarious intersections and realities and lived experiences for Indigenous women and girls, particularly as it relates to policing. So this question here for me is really about starting to see not only the intersectional relationship between policing and identities, but also beginning to explore the ways in which policing isn't just the racial violence, but it is a gendered violence and ableist violence, so on and so forth. So my question for you is, how does this intersectional race-based analysis of policing enable us to understand it as gendered, class-based, ableist, and transphobic implications of that state-sanctioned violence? So I'd love to hear from you, Sandy, because I know in our earlier conversations, gender was one of those things.
Yeah, I actually think that gender and gender-based violence and the way that people who are women and who don't identify as men, who are cis women, trans women, and gender non-binary kind of prove what we're saying about police not keeping us safe. Or not being a force whose purpose is even about safety. But we don't hear about our experiences as much in the media. And so what I mean when I say that is I'll tell a story to start, and then I'll kind of dive in. When I was taking criminal law this year, in school, if you're at a very kind of traditional law school, one of the ways that they engage the classroom is like this really something called the Socratic method, where they they'll just point to someone and ask you a question about something that you were supposed to have read the night before, and you're supposed to kind of perform on the spot. And so that day, my professor was like, Sandy, what is your favorite theory of punishment that you read about last night? And I was like, favorite theory of punishment. I was like, I don't like any of the theories of punishment. I don't have a favorite one. I'm an abolitionist, you know, like in a longer context. And then he said to me, oh yes, we'll see what happens when we get to the sexual assault cases. And moved on, right? As though policing, as though the way that we punish people or we use punitive measures in our society is somehow keeping us safe. It is often, you know, gender-based violence is often used as like a justification for why something needs to continue. But like, let's look at the landscape, right? I mean, I during this period, these last couple of months, when I've been doing a lot of interviews, there will be a lot of interviewers who will ask me, well, how much is enough, Sandy? Do you want to defund the police this much or that much, or you know, like what exactly do you want? And I'll say, well, why don't we start with what the police do well? Can you tell me anything? And the only thing that people will often cling to is, well, what will we do about rape? What will we do about sexual assault? And it's like, how did we get so propagandized into thinking that the police are doing anything about that? Right now, you know, it's less than, in Canada, less than 10% of sexual assaults are reported to the police. Many people don't even know about the class action lawsuit that was ongoing with the RCMP about sexual misconduct that's been going on for the last few months. Like an ongoing investigation that could have really been elevated as part of this discussion, but hasn't been, right? This week, it was revealed that a police officer in the Toronto Police Services has been involved in some sort of underage human trafficking scheme, right? The amount of interactions that police have with you know, either with women or people who don't identify with a particular gender or with trans people are extremely violent, and we do not hear those stories enough. Those stories are erased from us. You know, like the way that the setup, even the setup of the watchdog bodies are set up so that we never hear those stories and we never hear of how it is that the police are interacting with us. So, because this is like a two-part problem. The police are violent to us, and they don't care when other people are violent to us. They are not set up to provide safety in that way. And I mean, I know the question was broader than just gender, but I just think that, you know, gender does a lot to prove what we're saying about the police not really giving a damn about safety or security. Mm-hmm. We can provide that far better in our society.
Thank you so much for that, Sandy. I think it's really poking this idea that policing protects women can begin with the question of which women, right? I mean, names if you got them, right? But the reality is that that's not true for Indigenous women, for poor women, for sex working women, for mad women, for trans women, for undocumented women. That pretty much everybody. Like, so I think this also leads really well into looking at those intersections as far as Indigenous, the experiences of Indigenous communities go. And I'd love to hear about that, Caitlin, particularly if you can expand on your point about Indigenous women and girls.
Absolutely. So I think that, again, it comes back to this whole idea of contextual history, where identity is such a huge aspect of who we are and how people function as a society, about how we function together, about our interpersonal relationships. And ultimately, I think all of that feeds directly into how healthy our society is as a whole. And that idea of colonialism that was pushed into our communities, and the idea of Christianity and Catholicism as religions or ideas and beliefs that were forced onto us through this whole process of the residential school system and also through the Indian Act. We also have to understand that the Indian Act in and of itself is a patriarchal piece of legislation that was designed by a society who was built, the foundations of it are Christian. And so all that idea of identity and who you are as a person, whether or not, how much power you have within a society, being a female versus living in a male-based society, all of that has very much influenced who people are, and it very much has influenced our roles right now in society, and also has placed our women and our children in very precarious positions where they're often the first people who require police assistance and don't get it, or people who identify as being two-spirited, people who identify as being queer or trans. These are all people who fundamentally had such beautiful positions of power within our society, and who had such honored gifts to give. And that's not the case in necessarily a very Christian or Catholic traditional society. And they have, I feel, suffered the most in terms of their interactions with police. They have suffered the most in terms of that loss of identity and the strength in identity. They are the individuals who, when they suffered all of the affects of the residential school system, the 60 scoop, all of the child welfare, their involvement with the child welfare system, these are all individuals, females, two-spirited, trans, children. These are often people who are in the most need of support and to have such value. And often those are the people that we're seeing struggling with substance abuse, mental health issues. They're the ones who are placed in these awful positions of having to live on the streets because they can't either be within their families, because we've lost those cultural teachings about how important these people are. And we have dysfunctional and fractured families ourselves, or reserve systems ourselves, and they're having to move away from that, and they're having to move away from any sense of stability or safety. And when you have that, as we know, you often are in these positions where the first people that you run into are police. You're putting yourself in positions where if you're having a breakdown, or you're having to make money in ways to support yourself that put you right in the line of police, we see that there are huge implications for that, and it's devastating, and it can often lead to a loss of life for Indigenous people, and this is the reality that we're living in. But this wasn't supposed to be our reality. We had very much a system and a way of living that embraced a lot of the factors that are persecuted by the government and by police. And I think that when we're talking about that intersectionality, you have to start there.
Thank you so much for that, Caitlin, and thank you for bringing together the breakdown and loss of kinship as one of the things that means that our communities are not in a healthy place and are not able to sustain a sense of safety within them. I'd love to hear from you, Robin, about the question around intersectional analysis of policing and violence.
Sure, thank you so much. And I mean, Caitlin and Sandy's points, I think, really do get to the heart of the fact that the police are, in fact, even and especially in the context of gendered violence, are not protecting. You know, people often, as Sandy's pointing out, saying, what about the rapists? Well, I think precisely the answer is that even for white middle-class women, you know, the question, what about the rapist, means that the vast majority of rape and sexual assault is not actually persecuted, right? And also just the fact that, in fact, often in the cases of, for example, if we look to recent Human Rights Watch reports in British Columbia, or the situation of the police treatment of Indigenous women in Val d'Or, Quebec, that it's actually sometimes the police, and Black women as well, that sometimes it's the police that are actually the perpetrators of that sexual assault themselves, right? So again, bringing us back to the fact of what does policing actually do versus what do we imagine that it does. So I think that I want to take a moment to think about this intersectionality. I really appreciate this question, because of course the policing of Black cis men is an absolute crisis. The levels of deaths at the hand of police, the levels of violence is egregious and something that we absolutely need to address with our movements, with our liberation movements, with our scholarship. But making space for the realities of those who, of Black women, of Black cis and trans women, of Black gender non-conforming people, of Black non-binary people is absolutely crucial. It does not take space away from the fact that we need to look at the realities of Black cis men. But if we ignore the realities of those outside of the Black cisgender male, we're missing a really important element of how policing of Black lives takes place. And we're also missing a really important opportunity of how to actually combat the policing of Black people more broadly. So if we look to the realities of Black women, first of all, we see that Black women are not immune from the kinds of policing, the kinds of surveillance, stop, arrests, and violence that Black cisgender men face. We know that Black women are stopped disproportionately compared to both white women and white men. We know that Black women are dramatically incarcerated, vastly over the rate of white women who are incarcerated. We can look to the death of Shabrana Abdi, who is a Black Somali transgender woman, who of course was dragged down several flights of stairs by the police and died in 2003. The recent case of Majiza Phillip, a Black woman in Montreal who had her arm broken by the police and then herself was criminally charged, to see that Black women are not immune from the very direct kinds of police violence that Black men face. But it's also important, I think that if we look to the realities of Black women, we see that actually even more clearly, the policing is not just the police. Right? So if we look to the heightened surveillance of Black families, particularly poor Black women, by Child and Family Services, we know that Black children are more likely to be apprehended, are spending far longer in care, the care that is often negligent and harmful in and of itself, that this removal from families is a kind of punishment of Black families, that particularly targets the parenting of poor Black women. And we need to understand this as such. And if we don't actually understand this as a kind of racial profiling, as a kind of violence that we need to address the same way that we need to address carding and its impacts on young Black men, then we're missing a crucial element of actually the kind of harm that is being done to the Black community more broadly. If we look to the realities of schools, we again see similar issues where we know that that the school to prison pipeline means that Black kids are being disproportionately expelled, disproportionately suspended, and a significant treatment of Black moms, and it's often Black moms trying to advocate for their kids, is a part of that criminalization within the school system. So again, if we really want to understand the policing of Black people's lives, understanding the gendered way that this works actually helps us to see policing and harm in far more institutions. It's also really, if we also even think about the case of the 6-year-old Black girl in the Peel School region who was handcuffed hand and feet, right? It's just really important for us to understand that age is no protection, that being understood or read as female is no protection from the harm of policing itself. Now, if we want to speak intersectionally in a different way, of course, it's really important for us to understand the way that ableism and the way that mental health also is exacerbated by, and really is something that makes even more deadly the kinds of anti-Black racism that we have in our society. So 70% of police killings over the last 20 years in Canada are people who had mental health or substance abuse issues, right? And again, vastly disproportionately people who are Black, people who are Indigenous. So if we're not understanding the confluence of those factors, then we're really missing a crucial way in which Black people are dying, right? And we can look to recent cases where Black people or their families had called the police for help in a mental health crisis, like the situation of DeAndre Campbell, or a Black Indigenous woman, Regis Kaczynski-Peke, who ended up dying in the context of police of police interactions. So there again, we see the absolute failure on every front of policing to protect Black people. And we see also the ways in which the policing of Black people, the surveillance of Black communities is not only embedded into policing and the prison system in Canada, but it's absolutely integral that we see this in the child welfare system, in the education system as well. So it's actually in having an intersectional perspective that we're able to fully understand the depth to which anti-Blackness and the policing of Black life has permeated our society so completely. And that's essential if we're going to have meaningful efforts to actually reduce the violence of policing. The work to defund and abolish police is something that absolutely comes from a Black feminist tradition in many ways. It's about survivors. A really important part of this intellectual and political lineage comes from survivors of sexual violence, who of course often were again harmed by police when they attempted to defend themselves. And that is looking at that failure and the work that comes from people who've experienced sexual violence and other kinds of violence, that some of the really powerful growth of the police defunding, the police abolition moves makes all the more powerful, right? It's coming already from an intersectional place, that particularly those who would most need protection in our society. So people living with mental health issues, people who are homeless, people who are outside of the traditional gender paradigm, who are actually the most vulnerable to police violence. So if we're going to consider safety, removing police from all of these situations is one important step towards doing that, as well as, of course, addressing the conditions that have abandoned people in the first place, right? Which is lack of access to decent and safe housing, which is the fact that women's shelters are so drastically underfunded that they're almost continuously full, which is the fact that there's the lack of even decent access to food and transit, which means that people, again, are just in conditions of depravity. It's addressing those conditions as opposed to policing the people who actually need support in those conditions that needs to be how we actually respond as a society.
Thank you so much for that, Robin. I think you lead us really beautifully into our next question, which I'm merging with our Q&A because there were similar reflections and questions from our audience here today. So I think one of the things that's difficult to start wrapping our heads around is, how do we actually do it? Like, how do we get there? And once we get there, what does it look like? And if we recognize it, how do we sustain it? And I think one thing that I'll offer for everybody is to give ourselves permission not to come up with a one thing that will take up the entire footprint of the criminal justice system, policing, and incarceration, and start to think, what does really investing in the well-being and the health of our communities look like as a starting place? I know that can be quite challenging to think about. It's hard to think about what will do all the things, because prison is a catch-all for all kinds of things, as is policing, right? Like poverty, mental health crisis, substance use, sexual assault, all kinds of different things. So I'll offer that as sort of the foundation for that question. And I'd love to ask is, what are our options? What can we do? How do we get there? Help. And I'd love to hear from Caitlin first when you're ready.
It's such a big question. And I think in answering it from an Indigenous perspective, it comes back again to that idea of where did we come from? And what did we traditionally have in our societies? And how did we traditionally look at that idea of justice and that idea of policing ourselves so that we didn't have to have an independent force to do it for us? And we have in Canada, we have a really varied history of policing. We have over 600 different specific First Nation reserves within Canada, federally recognized bands. But also we have, not only our inherent right to govern ourselves, but we also are identified in Section 35 of the Constitution Act as being allowed to do that for ourselves in terms of the ability to self-govern as Indigenous people of this country. And so we've seen it come a long way from being policed by the RCMP or the Northwest Mounted Police through to where we are today, which in the 70s and 80s, there was huge movement and push towards this recognition that having non-Indigenous people police Indigenous communities was not working. It just wasn't. And so creating agreements and funding agreements that are still incredibly contentious, because obviously they do not fund Indigenous-led community policing as well as they do other policing agencies. But regardless, we recognize how important it was that it exists in the first place. And so we have, for example, within Ontario, the Anishinaabe-Aski Police are one of the biggest First Nation policing forces within this province. They are totally charged with governing a lot of First Nations communities, and they do it through a very community-led approach. And for example, I think that there was this actually beautiful written article about the NAPS police and their decades of service, where there has not been a single shot that has killed a First Nations person in decades of service that has occurred between NAPS and between these First Nations communities. And so it's possible. Governing and policing and creating a community-based led approach without mortal violence is possible. And so I think that you need to, that's the foundation at which you need to start from, is that if you really want to take a look at a society where there's genuine justice that involves reconciliation and restitution when harms are done from one person to another, you really need to be in a social situation where people and communities are well-resourced, where we have those support systems in place that allow people to be healthy and to operate or to seek out assistance when it's needed, where we're not struggling with all of these ideas of violence that often comes from histories that start in childhood, histories that start as a result of not having access to a lot of those capital gains and systems that our society is based on. And so when you come from there and you realize that, you know, true justice doesn't happen through police, you know, you can't arrest your way to justice. So I think when you realize that and you start to understand that not only can you not arrest your way there, but that police in and of themselves are inherently within a system that is so broken, and that there have been so many efforts at reforming police systems through better training, through more oversight, through diversity hiring. There's just been so much that people have done throughout the years to try and get the policing system healthier, and we've clearly seen that it's not working. Looking at the statistics right now in Canada, in June 2020, our rate of death by police violence was higher than all of 2019. And it's a reflection on itself. It's a reflection of how unhealthy intrinsically our society and system is, and then also how unhealthy it is of the people who are policing us. And so when you take a look at that, I think really what you realize is that first off, for Indigenous people, we need to get back to that place where we were policing ourselves and having that community-based force that we could call on as more peacekeepers, rather than people who were overtly, you know, making sure that you're not transgressing the criminal code and all the violations of the criminal code. And then also, I think that we need to understand that not only though, as a community, we have a huge role in becoming healthy ourselves, policing ourselves, but then also we cannot expect that some policing institution that was designed in and of itself to displace and control people and dispossess people, we can't rely on that for justice. So I totally have to say that I do agree with that mantra of, you know, defunding the police for the purpose of putting those resources that are so needed into other ways to make the entire community so much healthier.
Thank you so much for that, Caitlin, and thank you for reminding us of the relationship between interpersonal harm and institutional barriers and realities, that those things are not mutually exclusive, and that addressing the health of our communities and our safety and belonging will transform harm in our lives drastically. I'd love to turn it over to Robin to hear about your insights. How are we going to get there?
Sure, I think that's a great question, and I think that it's one that's being answered in the streets, in communities as we speak, right? That we're in a context where there are Black-led and multiracial uprisings all across North America at absolutely historic rates. You know, the protests that are ongoing, even though it's outside often of the spectrum of the media at this time, that there have been over 70 protests related to defunding, even just in Canada in recent months, that there is a movement to defund, disarm, dismantle, and abolish the police and policing across North America, across this country, that's taking into account municipal policing, RCMP, the relationships between Canadian Border Services Agency and CSIS, that we're seeing a really strong community-based movement that actually insists that we can absolutely have a police-free future, that we can actually create a society in which we are not so encumbered by the ongoing violence that is policing. So if I can think about the words of Mariame Kaba, who articulates this so clearly, in working to defund the police and working to speak about what it means to abolish the police, she says, we are not abandoning our communities to violence. It's just about actually managing and preventing violence and harms in a way that is actually taking those issues seriously. In fact, if we continue to leave things as they are, we see that we have at this time abandoned our communities to violence, leaving people with no safe place to live, with no place to go if they're experiencing harm. And our only solution as a society for that right now is police. So us working to create a society that actually addresses the conditions of violence, of harm in a serious way, is something that's absolutely about building a better world. It's about building the conditions for real safety, right? So it's not only about taking something away, but it's actually about creating a different kind of society that actually addresses, instead of policing, issues of gross racial and economic inequalities. So if we think about the fact that over 80% of policing right now is used to answer calls in terms of domestic disturbances, of suicide, of drug overdose, of mental health crises, we know that for each of those issues, policing itself is actually something that exacerbates and can even make those issues more difficult. We know that, for example, people who are out overdosing often don't want to call the ambulance because they worry that the police will show up, which is something that actually, very regularly happens. So we know that armed law enforcement is not a solution to most of the issues that we call crises in our society. And we know that there are crises where people need to be supported. But the answer is, what if we chose to meet people's needs instead of policing those needs? It's really important for us to remember precisely that policing has failed to do the things that our society needs to do. So we know that there are many answers that can work towards minimizing those harms that can happen and are being pushed for right now. Decoupling the police from Canada Border Services Agency, for example, so that a Black undocumented family who speeds through a red light isn't going to end up spending 1 to 5 to who knows how many years in immigration detention. Remember, Canada has no end, no definite end to how long detention can last, that we are already reducing the harm that police can do in that situation. Decoupling police from schools, pulling the Special Resource Officers Program, which is the police presence in schools, is something that has already been won by Black Lives Matter, Toronto, Education Not Incarceration, and LAN, for example, in the Toronto District School Board, which is Canada's largest school board, is something that is already being worked on in Hamilton, that we're already seeing a pause for this in Kitchener-Waterloo, that these are things that are happening that are making people safer as we speak. Decoupling police from mental health response is another way that we can imagine quite viscerally what it means to actually reduce immediately the scope of policing over people's lives. So it's important to remember it's not just this pie in the sky idea. It's actually a series of tactics that move toward reducing the scope, reducing the power, reducing the funding towards police, and reinvesting in actually meeting those needs, including reinvesting police budgets, but also reinvesting our societal efforts in actually meeting people's needs more seriously. If we look to the fact that over 90,000 drug arrests happens in 2017, when we know that drug arrests directly are related to things like HIV transmission, things like overdose, that decriminalization and harm reduction supports can actually meet those needs. Again, this is something that could literally be done incredibly quickly if we saw the political will to do so, right? That the kinds of harms that we're seeing, it's a political choice to continue to allow people to be harmed and to allow people to die preventable deaths at the hand of police when we have so many other solutions available.
Thank you so much for that, Robin. Sandy, I'd love to hear from you. Oh, you're muted.
Yes, and I'll keep it very tight because I know we're running out of time, but I just want to hail up everything that Caitlin and Robin said. Like, this is about, I see the questions in the chat about, okay, well then if it's not police, how do we address these issues of safety in our community? That's the big question. And it's like that question needs to be addressed, outside of the police, is because what we know right now from, this discussion, but from also like these decades, centuries of experience with policing is that they are not the solution. We know that for sure. So why don't we take the billions of dollars that are going into that as a solution, as a failed attempt to create safety in our society, and put it towards, and what is it that we think about as crime in our society? It's stuff that emanates from scarcity and from precarity. So why don't we just give people what they need? Let's give them housing. Let's give them food. Let's make sure that people who need to get out of a domestic violence situation have access to go to get out, to go to a shelter. Let's fund those things, because we know we have these resources and studies that show that those things create safety far more effectively than police. The police are the easy answer to just throw some money at because it sounds good in an election campaign. Honestly, that's what it is. It's like, I'm gonna be tough on crime, create safety for you. That's not what happens though. That is, taking resources away from us to create these resources that we truly, truly need. And I just wanna, in the chat, they've put defundthepolice.org. It's something that BLM, myself, Robin, and a few other really great people worked on, this resource, so that people can kind of see what some of those alternatives are. So, the discussion was really short, but there's a lot on that website. And I just wanted to close out by saying, look, we're gonna win this fight. And I know that because things can't continue as they are. They can't, because we will continue to fight them. And so their only options are to eliminate us, which we've already showed they can't do. They've tried. They can't eliminate us. Or we just stop fighting, which is obviously not going to happen, or we win. So I would just like to speed up this process. Let's just get it over with now. This will not continue forever. The solutions are in the community. And, this fight is going to continue until we win.
Thank you so much, Sandy, Robin, and Caitlin. You've lifted me up a lot in the conversation today. I think all of us in this particular moment, sitting in the cradle of intersecting pandemics, are having those days where it's like, is the world worth saving? And other days where a reminder that freedom is a constant struggle, right? But also a reminder that, yeah, we will get our freedom with or without you. Are you coming or not? That's really where we're at right now. And a reminder that the conversations we had here today shouldn't just live in your heads, to find the courage to take them to your kitchen tables, to do the interpersonal work of transformation and justice, to let go of justice as punishment or retribution, to start thinking about what would transform our communities, fundamentally the harm within them, to start thinking about what are the skill sets that you can individually cultivate. What will you offer freedom, and what will you bring to that liberated world? And I'll remind everybody, because I know that people are also tweeting at me about how to not call the police. I'll remind you that not calling the police in a moment is about every choice you've made up until that moment. Do you know your neighbors? Do you have, first aid training? Are you trained to intervene if somebody's in an overdose? Do you have the skill sets to navigate conflict and difficult conversations? We're not helpless, and we're not without tools, and we're not without knowledge. So deep dive into it, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to connect with you again. I want to hand it back to Joshua.
Thank you, Rania. Thanks everyone for joining us. On behalf of the MyZM team, I'd like to thank again our moderator Rania, our panelists Sandy, Caitlin, and Robin. You guys are all doing incredible work and really truly serve as an inspiration to us all. So Thank you to our audience. I'd also like to remind everybody in the audience that these conversations don't need to end here and now. In fact, they probably shouldn't. I hope you can take some of what has been shared today as a seed for thought and carry these conversations on within your own community, your family, your circle of friends, and potentially consider how your own positionality or agency situates you to create change. If you found today's discussion insightful or inspiring, I have good news. We at Myseum tend to do these types of panels fairly often. We actually have an ongoing program at the moment right now, every Tuesday and Thursday, called Ask an Elder. You can essentially book and have a one-on-one conversation with Elder Duke Redbird. And I'm sure if you are left with any questions from today's conversation, Elder Duke would love to engage with you on those subjects. So if you want to stay in the loop and make sure you don't miss our next program, I'd like to invite you to follow Myseum of Toronto on social media or visit our website and subscribe to our newsletter. And lastly, if you'd like to revisit this conversation, it'll be available on Facebook Live immediately after the broadcast. So thanks again, Rania, Sandy, Caitlin, Robin. So thankful you could join us today. And you guys take care and have a good day.